shall it be?
The space race began on October 4th, 1957, with the launching by the Soviets of the Sputnik satellite.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. Further details on an assassination attempt against President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was shot as he drove from Dallas Airport to downtown Dallas.
Answer to a very simple question. Are we alone as conscious beings in this entire buzzing 400 billion star galaxy, one of 10 to the 10th other galaxies?
A ball with 4 antennae emerged to go it alone in the darkness of space. And a radio began to send a signal back to Earth. Humanity had entered the space age.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And brought back a distance of perhaps 200 yards to completely expose the 3-stage rocket to view. Here she goes, flaming shooting out from under the bottom of it. And a huge, huge ball of fire rising up perhaps 100 feet.
The space race, a presidential assassination, and the ongoing search for extraterrestrial life. These were some of the events which have shaped the world as we know it today. But consider for a moment what life would be like if things happened a little differently. 2017's Prey is a window into this Elseworld, an alternate history where Lee Harvey Oswald never made it to that grassy knoll, where the Cold War ended in a partnership, and where humans got an answer to that age-old question, are we alone in the universe? Prey posits a piece of historical fiction in which all of these possibilities are connected, allowing for humankind to progress forward at a rate unheard of outside of an Arthur C. Clarke novel. But is there such a thing as reaching too far, too fast? We need look no further than the Talos 1 space station for an answer. Of course, before we do that, we first have to piece together how this marvel of science and ingenuity came to be, and how greed and competition could bring it all crashing down to Earth. On March 3, 1912, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "Competition has been shown to be useful up to a certain point and no further. But cooperation, which is the thing we must strive for today, begins where competition leaves off." Strange that an American president would say this when 43 years later, the United States would be embroiled in the greatest competition of the 20th century. The road to Talos 1 begins with, pardon my French, a pissing contest known as the space race. While the space race has its roots in 1930s Germany, the movement as we know it truly began in the mid-1950s. The two Cold War rivals, the Democratic United States and the Communist USSR, were in heated competition to be the first superpower to escape the Earth's gravitational pull. Following the Second World War, the Americans left the European theater with a bunch of German rocket scientists as souvenirs. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the technical director of Germany's ballistic missile program. An engineering prodigy, von Braun was part of the team that created the A-4 rocket, the first vehicle to ever reach outer space. The Soviets recruited German engineers as well, but their MVP wasn't some ex-Nazi scientist, but someone homegrown. Sergei Korolev, a Ukraine native turned rocket engineer, was tasked with leading the Soviet space program in order to ensure that the USSR beat the United States in the race to the stars. Their efforts paid off, for in October 1957, the Soviets took the lead when they launched Sputnik 1 into orbit. Roughly a month later, they would also send the first animal into space, a small dog named Laika, who would be the sole occupant of the Sputnik 2 spacecraft. Sadly for the four-legged cosmonaut, it was a one-way trip, as she died mere hours after the launch. This is where the alternate history of Prey's universe diverges from the real. In 1958, the Soviets launched another satellite, the Verona 1, to secure their lead in the space race. However, shortly after, communications with the Verona ceased, and as a result, the Soviets sent a manned spacecraft to investigate. The Verona's hull was undamaged, so the repair team were instructed to breach the satellite to determine if the issue was internal. What the cosmonauts found inside was beyond anything they could have anticipated. Non-terrestrial life forms. Hostile. Alien. The crew of the mission didn't survive. Footage of the encounter was labeled highly classified, and the Soviets would make efforts to contain the threat in secret. It would be another 2 years before they learned what FDR already knew, that cooperation solved problems far better than competition. In the interim, we're going to jump backwards in time for a bit. 8 years in time to be precise. This detour might seem out of place, but I promise it serves a purpose. In 1950, an Italian-American physicist named Enrico Fermi was having lunch with some colleagues discussing, of all things, the recent increase of UFO sightings. You know, light chit-chat. At some point during the conversation, Fermi exclaimed, "Where is everybody?" While seemingly innocuous, those 3 words together formed a loaded question that persists even to this day, as it is the foundation of the Fermi paradox, a model which comments on the probability and apparent lack of evidence of alien civilizations. The basic framework of the concept is that there are billions upon billions of stars in the galaxy, some with planets similar to our own. These Earth-like worlds aren't too hot or too cold and have just the right amount of nitrogen and carbon dioxide in their atmospheres, making them the perfect cocktail to support life. Not just microbial life either, but complex, intelligent life. And these life forms might have existed long enough to develop interstellar travel, which, even at the slowest envisioned pace of technological development, means aliens could have colonized the Milky Way galaxy in just a couple million years. In other words, they have had plenty of time to make their presence known to us. And yet, we've seen nothing. To many, this lack of evidence ostensibly means extraterrestrials don't exist, that we are the only intelligent life forms in the vast expanse of the galaxy. But that's an audacious conclusion based on incomplete observations. The simplest explanation is that there's just too much cosmic real estate to cover. After all, we're just one pale blue dot in a mote 100,000 light-years in diameter. That's an unfathomable tract of space to cover, and it's next to impossible for us to send probes that far into the infinite. It's also probable that because of the inhospitable nature of our universe during its infancy, other alien civilizations have followed an evolutionary path similar to our own and just aren't spacefaring yet. Additionally, there are those who argue that if there are alien civilizations out there, we should have at least received signals or transmissions of theirs, like bottled messages floating endlessly, just waiting to be found and deciphered. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that whatever means of communication these aliens are using, it's something humans can detect or understand. It would be like using an iPhone to pick up an electric telegraph signal. It just doesn't compute. Another explanation is that the extraterrestrials are just avoiding us, likely due to our relatively primitive place on the Kardashev scale. Now, for the uninitiated, the Kardashev scale is a method of measuring a civilization's technological prowess based on the amount of energy a civilization uses to sustain itself. There are 3 categories: Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 civilizations. Type 1 civilizations use and store energy provided by its parent star, such as our own sun, to sustain itself. Type 2 civilizations can harness all of the energy from its planet star using a device like a Dyson sphere. Type 3 civilizations can draw and control energy on the scale of an entire galaxy. For all intents and purposes, a Type 3 civ might as well be gods to us simple backwater apes. And to those who took offense at me describing human technology as primitive, just for the record, we're not even Type 1 yet. And of course, there's always the possibility that maybe we really are alone. The only form of life there is, drifting precariously, vulnerably, on a chunk of flotsam out in the darkest sea imaginable. Scary thought, I know. Still, it took 3.5 billion years for intelligent life to develop on our own world, and we owe much of our progress to sheer luck. Maybe the old adage is true. Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. Either way, Prey provides its own solution to the Fermi paradox. But as one would expect, the answer only creates more questions. However, we'll save that bit for the end. In 1960, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev contacted President John F. Kennedy to come clean about the alien threat discovered in the Verona satellite. He pleaded for assistance in the containment of these strange creatures. That handshake solidified a peace with the two superpowers publicly breaking bread and agreeing to cooperate on all spacefaring ventures. 3 years later, their efforts would result with the creation of the Kletka facility. Kletka was a joint venture, constructed to contain the non-terrestrial life forms within. However, the US-Soviet partnership encountered a not-so-minor hiccup. In the wake of a failed assassination attempt, Kennedy returned to office emboldened with a greater sense of purpose. Khrushchev, however, had been ousted by his party members, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin, who agreed to sell Kletka to the US. It was repurposed for studying the non-terrestrials, now labeled Typhon, and over the course of the next 16 years, the US transformed the station into a fully functioning R&D facility. However, because of their détente with the Soviets, the US adopted an anti-interventionist stance, allowing the Iron Curtain to expand not just beyond the Soviet Union and China, but to Vietnam as well. Kennedy turned a blind eye to the expansion of communism. His second term was instead dedicated upwards, with the US having launched a series of successful moon landings. Despite the Soviets' decision to hand Kletka over to us Yankees, they too maintained a growing desire to reach out and touch the stars. In contrast to the competition of the space race, the US and the Soviets seemed to be working together. And as such, a burgeoning space program on both fronts enjoyed approval from both within halls of government and the public eye. It was a golden age of development, which culminated with the establishment of Project Axiom. This period saw advancements in the field of bioscience fundamental to neurological engineering. The future was looking more and more promising by the day. But a flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. 16 years after the establishment of Kletka, geopolitical instability started to place strain on the US-Soviet space programs. The decline started sometime in 1980 when President Reagan expressed a desire to shift focus away from space exploration towards issues more relevant to your average Joe and Jane. Perhaps the economic collapse caused by the USSR's space program had something to do with this decision, or perhaps it was the lack of advancement that space seemed to promise. Regardless of his reasons, the decision to abandon all spacefaring projects was solidified by a containment failure aboard the Kletka, which resulted with an entire research team being killed by the Typhon specimens. Dubbed the Pobeg incident, this tragedy, combined with the geopolitical instability on Earth, resulted with Washington pulling the plug on the project. Kletka would be decommissioned and ultimately abandoned. In reality, 1991 saw the fall of the Iron Curtain. However, in the alternate history of Prey, the Iron Curtain still hung heavily. While the US strove to maintain good relations with the USSR, there was actually lingering apprehensions between the two countries. Despite this, the Soviets continued their expansion through the Eastern Bloc, and with each annexation, the chorus of dissent grew louder and more aggressive, and not just from the West, but from within the boundaries of the ever-expanding motherland. The Mensheviks, in particular, were deeply opposed to Soviet expansion. Historically, they were a faction of the Russian socialist movement, known for having fought against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. But in the context of Prey's timeline, the Mensheviks would lead a rebellion against the Soviets after an event called the Soviet Indian Intervention, which precipitated something called the Second Purge. The details of these occurrences are never provided, though one could speculate the Second Purge has something to do with the Great Purge, which was the Soviet campaign to repress tens of millions of political dissidents between the years 1936 and 1938. The Second Purge likely involved much of the same. The events of the next couple decades sadly are not diligently chronicled. We know, according to the Too Far, Too Fast document, that support for the space race ended in the Reagan era. Without any military application for the technology, the administration could no longer justify the expense, and with no significant threats to the US, there was little incentive to continue the pursuit. As J.V. Edwards stated, their only competition, the Soviets, had already showed the danger of reaching too far, too fast. Space was fated to become the domain of private organizations. One such organization was TranStar Industries, a high-tech megacorporation founded in the year 2025. Its board of directors would go on to purchase and privatize the Kletka facility that same year. While the majority of the company's directorate are anonymous, there are two members of the board who haven't shied away from the spotlight. William and Catherine Yu acted as the public face of TranStar. A true power couple in every sense, William was an accomplished neuroscientist from China, while the German-born Catherine made her mark as a businesswoman. Their two children, Morgan and Alex Yu, also played pivotal roles in the company, with the elder Yu, Alex, serving as the CEO of TranStar. Morgan followed in the family's footsteps as well, joining TranStar in 2027 as the director of research. By 2030, TranStar had refitted the modest Kletka facility into Talos 1, a massive space station dedicated to scientific innovation, high-end information technology, and of course, research and development. Locked in a slow waltz around their own moon, Talos 1 was an extravagant neo-deco dream outfitted with everything from living quarters to a lush arboretum to recreational centers for the more active members of the crew. Talos 1 ostensibly served as the corporate center of TranStar's laboratories. However, in truth, Talos 1's purpose was to pick up where the Kletka team left off, resuming research into the Typhon specimens contained within. The Kletka housed a couple different breeds of Typhon. The smaller of the two, the one which resembled a liquid shadow on spider legs, is called the Typhon cacoplasmus. Nicknamed the Mimic for its ability to imitate inanimate objects of similar mass, this little guy is actually the progenitor of the entire Typhon ecosystem. Mimics use other living organisms as a means of reproducing, a process which is fatal to anyone unlucky enough to fall prey to it. Typhon geniocratus, or the Weaver, was the other Typhon encountered on the Kletka. This creature was born through a process of metamorphosis, in which one mimic is repeatedly stung by others, triggering a rapid change in form, which ultimately results with the Weaver. The name Weaver was chosen due to its importance in the Typhon ecology, serving as a vector in the production of other Typhon species, as well as a substance known as coral. The coral itself is noted as being the most perplexing sample recovered from the Kletka. Its express purpose was never determined. Talos 1 researchers weren't even sure if it technically classified as a Typhon or if it was just waste material produced by weavers. Either way, it's this data that TranStar sought to use in their research. But to what end? We'll get there shortly. In the meantime, let's elaborate on the state of the world. While this period wasn't thoroughly documented as stated earlier, we do know some details about how technology affected modern society, the most substantial being the creation of the World Union Space Industry, or the WSI for short, which confirmed the notion of corporate entities pursuing ventures off-world. In particular, the White Stork Tower, or simply the space elevator, had allowed the US to dominate pretty much all orbital activities and commerce. Of course, Americans were never too keen on sharing, so when the WSI asked if they could use the Stork facility to create their own space elevators at a deflated cost, the US refused. Not that that would stop the WSI. They went on to purchase ideal sites for future space elevators anyway. Call it space-age squatting. Another incredible development was the creation of androids. Throughout Prey, we encounter service automatons called operators fairly frequently. However, we never actually get to see anything close to an android. Well, in this world, artificial humans actually do exist. The Proxies, Agents, and Personhood document made note of a robot named Ransom. A digital doppelganger of its owner, the android was molded of a ceramic and carbon body and could emulate the personality of its owner indistinguishably. If there ever is a Prey DLC, I'm hoping we'll get to see one of these. Even more fantastical was the existence of a manned moon base called the Pythias. Huddled deep in the crater on the lunar pole, the facility was permanently shadowed and surrounded by kilometers of ice. The crew of the Pythias weren't there searching for cheese, though. Beneath the facility was actually a vast network of claustrophobic tunnels where helium-3, hydrogen, and platinum were mined. In contrast to Talos 1, whose crew often forgot they were even in space, life on Pythias was an underworld, cold and dark, so far from the warming glow of the Earth that many of its crew suffered from severe depression, resulting with the occasional death by suicide. It would seem off-world habitats had a pretty bad track record in the universe of Prey, as there was also installations on Mars. These also didn't fare too well. They were small and Spartan in form and function, but staggeringly expensive to maintain. TranStar CEO Alex Yu had big plans for the Red Planet, however, as he begun to devise a means of terraforming the blast land using an extremophile organism which would convert the Martian atmosphere into one similar to our own. A bold venture indeed, one that would require a few centuries to take effect. In the meantime, TranStar would make do with another innovative product. In 2030, they released a neuromodifier, or neuromod for short, an injectable implant which, when administered into the eye, could modify the neurological wiring of the brain, granting the recipient a variety of new skills, knowledge, and abilities. In less time than it takes to snap a finger, users could become fluent in any language, or become virtuoso musicians, or have their lifespans extended, or any number of other physical and psychological augmentations. The neural data which makes up the connectomes of any given neuromod was provided by donors like Brandy Grace, an Olympic skater who suffered from a fictitious neurological disease called paraplexis. While Brandy and others afflicted by this condition couldn't use neuromods themselves, they could still donate, ensuring that their skills lived on in other users who could afford to pay TranStar's hefty fees. And the fees were hefty, as neuromods were considered a luxury affordable only to the mega-wealthy. However, while the idea of mapping a neighbor's talents and skills into an injectable was miraculous, the intentions behind a neuromod were anything but holy. They were actually designed with the Typhon in mind. In 2029, 1 year prior to the unveiling of Talos 1, a man named Alexei Petrov, along with 3 other members of the Menshevik movement, attacked and killed 32 people in Red Square. All 4 of these terrorists were arrested, tried, and sentenced to die. However, just 2 weeks from his execution, TranStar offered Petrov a chance to work as a human test subject in exchange for a commuted sentence. At first glance, this would seem like a pretty sweet deal. The program, called the TranStar Volunteer Initiative, gave these convicted criminals a second chance, an opportunity for redemption. And all they'd have to do is, as Petrov put it, go up to a space station and work on some top-secret science projects. But the volunteers didn't know what they were signing themselves up for. They ended up being guinea pigs in TranStar's experiments. Some, like Yuri Andronov, a former cosmonaut who was imprisoned by the Soviets for political dissent, ended up being sacrificed to the Typhon for research purposes. The process of creating neuromods was beyond inhumane. Volunteers were locked up inside containment cells with mimics, which would kill and absorb the human subjects. The mimics would then be recycled into raw exotic material, which could then be placed into a fabricator to produce neuromods based off of the Typhon organism. All in the name of progress. The unethical mistreatment of the volunteers was known only to select high-ranking members of Talos 1 and TranStar, including the entire U family and likely the board of directors, all of whom rationalized the decision as a necessary evil, as something which served the greater good of humanity. Whatever helped them sleep at night, I suppose. The process of injecting a needle into one's eye was a hard enough sell, but factor in the human cost, and it becomes obvious why TranStar's sales pitch would neglect to mention this. Despite TranStar's efforts to keep this under wraps, there were actually members of the Talos 1 crew whose sense of decency outweighed a desire to line their pockets. One woman in particular, Annalise Gallegos, felt a profound guilt for her role in the development of Typhon-based neuromods. The medical parasitologist would moonlight as a whistleblower in her attempt to sneak incriminating evidence onto a thumb drive, which would be smuggled back to Earth by a man named Quentin Purvis. It's unknown if they succeeded. Since the events of Prey are nothing more than a simulation, we can't really be too sure, but considering their fate in-game, it's likely that they failed and probably didn't survive the containment breach. Sometime in the year 2032, Morgan was transferred to Talos 1, where he spent the next 3 years working in the Psychotronics division. It was time well spent, as he played a role in the development of the Psychoscope, a nifty little gizmo designed to aid in the researching of the Typhon organisms. The device proved invaluable, as more was learned about the non-terrestrials in this short period of time than during the entirety of Project Axiom. One curious tidbit was the mechanics of how the mimic's imitation ability works. Initially believed to be the result of molecular reconstruction, the Talos crew had later hypothesized that the mimesis was caused by the mimic swapping itself with an object in a parallel reality, while somehow maintaining a conscious link to the object in our own universe. This might explain how the mimic survived the vacuum of space. They simply moved to an adjacent dimensional bubble, where time moves far slower, shifting back only when necessary. As Rory Mannion and Christine Lloyd put it, from the mimic's perspective, a 6 million year journey to our solar system in the form of an iron meteor might only take a few seconds. As the months passed, more species and subspecies of Typhon were discovered, which led to a wider array of abilities that could be mapped onto the neuromods. However, these were still prototypes and had yet to be tested on humans. Morgan, having grown tired of Progress's slow march and perhaps a little overconfident in his own mental fortitude, volunteered to be the main test subject in the Typhon neuromod trials. If all went well, he'd be able to emulate their abilities, discharging thermal energy from his mind, or psychokinetically manipulating items from a distance, or even camouflaging himself as a household object. I know what you're thinking. That doesn't sound like much of a sacrifice on Morgan's part. Well, there was a catch. While the neuromods could be installed with ease, removing them would erase the memory of the host, making the user forget everything they had experienced up until the moment when the neuromod was first installed. And because the trials required experimentation with many different types of neuromods, Morgan's memories would be repeatedly erased. From his perspective, he'd be reliving the same day over and over and over again, which, if Phil Connors is any indication, would be enough to drive a man mad. And it did, as Morgan started to become unpredictable and unstable, often erupting into violent outbursts. He became convinced that the Typhon were too dangerous to let live, and that the research conducted in Talos 1 needed to be destroyed. And he wouldn't be alone. There aren't many people who would be comfortable introducing alien DNA into one's body, even among Talos 1 personnel, or should I say, especially among Talos 1 personnel. After all, who would know the dangers the Typhon pose better than those who study them? Eventually, Morgan wised up to what was going on. No longer willing to participate in the project, he reprogrammed an operator, which he named January, to help him escape from the testing loop. Knowing that he would still be amnesia-stricken, Morgan duplicated his personality and uploaded it into January, while also recording a message for himself detailing his plans to destroy Talos 1. However, his brother Alex stopped him before he could set things into motion. Morgan was reintroduced back into the trials, where he remained until the beginning of the game proper. I'm not going to cover the events of Prey, though I do want to touch upon something Alex mentions during the endgame, something which I believe alludes to the motivations and possible greater nature of the Typhon. Alex's final transcribe says,
"We have the data to confirm what you suspected. The coral is broadcasting a neural signal, a secret message reaching out to the stars. What I want to know is what is the message, and who is listening to it. I have a feeling you already know."
The coral, whatever it is, was broadcasting a neural signal through space. But to what? And where? The Fermi paradox was referenced in-game not just because Prey is about aliens, but because part of the mystery is trying to understand where exactly the Typhon came from, and by a logical extension, what they are. We learn over the course of the game that their entire ecology is derived from the Mimic, a creature that has the ability to shift its physical self into an extra-dimensional pocket world, replacing its four-dimensional body with a duplicate proxy body. It's obvious that this is the reason why humans couldn't detect them, as they would have spent most of their existence in this alternate reality, only swapping back when encountering prey. This brings into question many things: the possibility of a greater intelligence, like a hive mind, and whether or not there's a Typhon civilization out there, somewhere amongst the stars. If so, are they governed by this hive mind? And more importantly, is their civilization truly their own, or is it based off of another extraterrestrial species they've encountered throughout the eons? Considering that weavers create additional Typhon from the bodies of the deceased, they might actually be a collector species of sorts, moving through the cosmos, killing and harvesting other alien intelligences until the species has been fully absorbed. There's also the possibility that the Typhon are, by nature, not of this universe. Their extra-dimensional abilities might imply that they're actually native to another plane of existence, and that the coral wasn't actually sending a message across space, but across dimensions. There are tons of possibilities, and zero indication as to what the answer actually might be. The just-in-case audio log hints at something I hoped would be addressed in the DLC. However, because of Prey's lackluster sales, I'm not exactly confident Bethesda has any plans to release any additional content. Fingers crossed that I'm wrong, but if not, we're just going to have to satisfy ourselves with what we got. Thankfully, what we got is self-contained enough for it to stand on its own 2 feet. So, is there such a thing as reaching too far, too fast? Depends on who you ask. You, or you. But whatever the answer, one thing is certain. We'll be better prepped for whatever the future may hold if we get there together.